So recording is beginning now. Next, we would like to share with you a portion of Peace's statement of purpose, which we understand this work to be guided by. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, so this is a portion of chapter 4. Among other things, it says, to fulfill our purpose, the church shall serve in response to God's love to meet human needs, caring for the sick and the aged, advocating dignity and justice for all people, working for peace and reconciliation among the nations, and standing with the poor and powerless, and committing itself to their needs. And we will respond to human need, work for justice and peace, care for the sick and suffering, and participate responsibly in society. So using this framework as a foundation, the first thing we did was consider what Peace was already involved with, and from there we began to understand some of the limits of direct service efforts, which then led us to begin exploring advocacy. And of course, part of the work that was happening at Peace was the Troubling the Waters study group, and we recently started a racial justice team, which is also very much a part of the way we want to be aware of who we are and how we are how we show up in the world, both as individuals and as a church. So all of the learning and the work that's happening at Peace kind of fits into this bigger picture of advocacy as well. And I will now turn over to Sue.
Thank you. One of the first things that we started to do was, I want to set up my screen too. Okay. Never mind. Well, that's okay. I don't know how to do it. There we go. I just wanted to see all of you at the same time.
Okay. Here we are.
Good. So one of the first things we did, we started talking about direct service and advocacy. And direct service is something that we seem to all be doing. We all recognize what it is. Peace has been involved in direct service since its very beginning. We are a founding member of ACA, for example. Many people give Christmas presents to Village of Hope in Haiti, Homework Club, lots of things that we do that specifically and directly help people in need is really what we're most familiar with. And I just ask you to think, I mean, we were able to think of things that we did. Can you think of things that you have done that are really direct service, helping other people? You thought of it, right? Okay, good. So then we began to explore what's advocacy and the difference between those two things. So the dictionary defines advocacy as pleading for, recommending, taking a position on something and urging others to take that position. And in our context, the context of the purpose of Peace, it really involves, or we've decided it does involve advocating to various levels of government on behalf of those in need. Food, housing, justice, protection of the earth, and so forth. Doing something beyond the service to try to change the basic policies and structures that cause those problems. That's really advocacy. Advocacy is a nonpartisan effort, which means we're not saying just to the Democrats, we're not saying just to the Republicans, and in fact, we're not presenting ourselves as Republicans or Democrats or Greens or whatever. We are strictly nonpartisan, meaning that we're urging the government as a whole. Generally speaking, the legislature, but oftentimes those in administrative branches as well. As Nadia mentioned, sometimes when we think of lobbying, we immediately think, oh no, that's not us. That's a nasty bad thing. Think of all those lobbyists in DC. So what's the difference between what I'm saying we're going to do or hope we're going to do? And the crucial difference is that when we're advocating on behalf of others. With lobbying, we're advocating for our own or our organization's interests. So let's think, for example, of the petroleum industry. They have people in DC trying to urge benefits for the petroleum industry. I worked some time ago for the National League of Cities. We lobbied Congress to provide more benefits for cities, direct federal funding and so forth. So that's the difference. Lobbying, unfortunately, sometimes the words are used interchangeably. And I don't think we should think of lobbying as a bad thing, because in a democracy, it's both free speech and it's, you might say, the competition among the various needs that helps our democracy to work. So I'm not saying lobbying is a really bad thing, but it's different from what we'll be doing. There's still some reservations about the separation of church and state. I remember once when somebody in our neighborhood put a big political sign in 2015 on church property. And I was like, you can't do that. Oh, yes, I can. It's out on the boulevard. I said, well, how about the separation of church and state? And she said, oh, that's right. And she took it down. The separation of church and state has nothing to do with that. It means something quite different, which means the government shall not be setting up or supporting churches. Well, in any case, what does our own Bishop Eaton have to say about lobbying? And I'll let Nadia turn that on.
Okay, thank you, Sue.
Bishop Eaton changed.
Thank you, Bishop Curry. And thanks for all of you for joining this webinar. The title itself, Advocacy Tools for Loving Your Neighbor, raises the question, what is the role of the church and faith-based organizations in the public square? Like my brother, Bishop Curry, and many of you, I have been charged with being political and not adhering to the principle of the separation of church and state, that the church should really stick to the spiritual matters and stay out of temporal ones. Let me clear something up. The First Amendment says, and I quote, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The amendment keeps the government out of the church, but in no way precludes the church from showing up in the public square. We Lutherans in what you Episcopalians call the Jesus movement understand that the church and state, the spiritual and the temporal, are both established by God and are both part of God's twofold rule. Both are good gifts from God. Active participation in public life by the faithful and emphasizing the duty of the government to care for its people, especially the most vulnerable, have been a part of the Lutheran movement from its beginning. When we pray this part of the Lord's Prayer, give us today our daily bread, Luther said, it would be more fitting if the coat of arms of every prince were emblazoned with a loaf of bread instead of a lion. Luther, as a spiritual leader, advocated for health care, education, and a community chest provided by local government. So to be clear, good government is a gift from God and a means by which God's abundant life can be experienced by all. The U.S. Constitution does not bar the church from participating in civic life. Engagement by the faithful in the public square is a way to live out our baptismal vocation. Advocacy is a deeply spiritual discipline. Lutherans like to identify ourselves as a church based on grace. In fact, grace is the most frequent answer to the question, what is Lutheran? It's as if we invented the concept. But Martin Luther also held up freedom as a key principle. In his letter, The Freedom of a Christian, Luther argues that since we have been set free by grace through the death and resurrection of Jesus, because this is a gift, because we don't have to work or earn our salvation, we are now free to serve the neighbor. In typical Lutheran paradox, Martin Luther wrote that the Christian is perfectly free, ruler of all, and perfectly bound and servant of all. We are not compelled to do good works in order to secure God's grace. We're free. It is in this freedom that we serve the neighbor. Indeed, Luther said, more to the point, each person lives only for others and not for himself or herself. This is at the center of our advocacy work. We're free to serve. Those whom we serve are not a means to an end, and we are bound to the neighbor. In my experience with meeting with members on Capitol Hill, this understanding of service based on Christian freedom was actually greeted with relief by the members and their staffs. It was clear that we didn't have any money. We weren't asking for anything for ourselves. We were advocating that all might have life and have it abundantly. When members saw that we wanted to work with them for a more just and equitable society, it opened up the conversation. Many times, government is perceived as faceless and uncaring. And as the adversary, our advocacy based on the notion that good government is a gift from God intended to promote human flourishing, and that we're seeking the good of the neighbor, sometimes became the occasion for those in office to talk about their own spiritual work and how this tied in with their deepest sense of call. That's why we do advocacy, and that's why advocacy gives us tools to love the neighbor.
Thank you very much.
Linda, over to you.
Okay. Just as Peace has been involved in different kinds of direct service, members of Peace have also been involved in some advocacy efforts. Some members have attended Bread for the World's advocacy days in years past. Bread focuses on national policy, primarily advocating with Congress. Some of us have also attended the Virginia Interfaith Center Public Policy Labor Day, which is held in Richmond every year. And they're focusing on needed changes at the state level, often meeting with our elected representatives. In both cases, we met with policymakers and elected officials and their staff and spoken on behalf of legislation that we believe would benefit those in need. And right here, Pastor Sarah has also been very active on the board of the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions. We'll have an opportunity to talk together in a little bit, but right now, start thinking about, I'll ask you to start thinking just to yourselves, what experiences have I had with advocacy, and what does advocacy mean to me? Now, as presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton explained, she talked about the underlying theological basis for involvement in advocacy. Here's another video that we're going to watch. It's an excerpt of a presentation given by Matt Gross, who is one of the lead organizers at Bread for the World. And Bread is a Christian advocacy organization that focuses on poverty and hunger issues. And in this presentation, Matt will be explaining some of the biblical underpinnings of advocacy and showing how that will can help us build toward a community of action. Let's see, Nadia?
a proud one. We're a national collective Christian organization. You can read that statement there, but I like to sort of put our mission sort of centrally focused, and it's something that our president-elect talks a lot about, Eugene Cho, but bread is about politics and policy and people. And I say that because politics shapes policy, and politics and policy impacts people. And as a Christian organization, we believe all people are created in the image of God, and we care and love people. And therefore, we have to be engaged in politics because politics shape policy and policy impact people. That's at the heart of what we do. Politics is a dangerous word these days, especially sometimes in the church. I have a good pastor friend who always jokes, I'm not sure why people of faith get so ruffled about politics. He always says, we invented it. Politics for bread is probably different than what we typically think about in our dominant culture these days. But again, politics is about policy and people for us. And it's about bipartisanship or nonpartisan work. We work with both sides of the aisle. We Democrats and Republicans from our board on down. We work on issues of hunger and poverty to try and find common ground, common space that we can seek to end hunger and poverty in our world. So that's a little bit about bread. I wanted to, for my presentation, I've been thinking a lot about, and as I wake up every day and look at the newspaper and look at images that I would describe as sort of scarcity images of empty shelves and people in lines and whatnot, I've been thinking a lot about that word scarcity and also about its counterpart of abundance and sort of that tension. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the story of the loaves and fishes, and start there and sort of contextualize the rest of the points I'd like to make about advocacy in the context of that story. I'm sure it's a story that you're all familiar with, so I'm not going to read it, but I've recently been reading over the Mark's narrative, and so I just wanted to lift up a few. Let's see. I'm sorry. I had to lift up a few points in there. Right. The central tension in that story, I would argue, and I'm not the first to do it, is what I think is the central tension in our culture and perhaps in our faith, and it's one that's perhaps more acute now than it's ever been, at least ever been in my lifetime. That's for sure. But it's that tension between scarcity and abundance, right? And the scarcity mentality comes out in the reaction of the disciples as they were, invited by Jesus to go away on retreat. So you can imagine they were ready and waiting for a little R&R. You can imagine sort of their frustration when they see this crowd, this enormous crowd. I sort of think it's perhaps how some of us are feeling every morning when we wake up and look at the newspaper and just think, oh my gosh, I don't want to deal with it anymore. I just want to throw it away, right? Throw it in the garbage can, send it away. And that's how they respond, right? They respond by saying, hey, let's just send them away. Let's get them out of here. Right? Send them into town. They can fend for themselves. And of course, that's not how Jesus responds. Jesus sees the crowd. He has compassion for it. I think he also sees beyond just that crowd and as a problem, but he sees what it can be. And Jesus' response is one that challenges us to be in what Walter Brueggemann calls a liturgy of abundance, right? So Jesus pushes the disciples into relationship with that crowd, and he reinforces their leadership in doing it. I think one of the key components of that story, and the narrative completely shifts, when 2 points. One, when he tells the disciples, hey, this isn't just your burden to bear. why don't you go see what the crowd has, right? And he sends them into the crowd to look for food. And they come out with the loaves and fishes, not very convinced, obviously. But the second part of what he does there, I think, is an organizing story. And it's one that gets overlooked time and time again. But he instructs the disciples. And I imagine Jesus could have gotten up on a rock or something and done this himself. But he instructs the disciples to go out and organize the crowd into groups of 50 and 100. And I like this picture. It's one of the few I've seen where you can literally sort of see the groups are sitting in groups of 50 and 100. They literally go organize the crowd. And so for the first time, this crowd becomes a community, right? And then Jesus blesses the bread, and instead of handing it out himself, which is often the depiction we see, he gives it back to the disciples, and he reinforces their leadership, and he says, you go distribute it. And as they do that, I think that's where the real miracle happens. And I don't think it just diminishes the miracle at all by sort of taking the magic out of it, by saying it's likely, I imagine, that as the disciples started handing out food, others in that community, as they started to see one another and get to know one another and see that folks were sharing, they started to share additional resources that they had, maybe that they were holding on to because they weren't exactly sure where this was going. So out of forming of a community comes common action and resources flow. Right? One other point that I think Mark really brings home that I think is important to note is that the disciples' own needs were met by trusting in the resources of others, by trusting in eventually in their own leadership and in the leadership of those in the crowd. As we know in the story, there were baskets of leftovers, one for all 12 tribes. That's the liturgy of abundance. And, I would invite you, as you go forward this evening, to think about that tension and to think about where you see it in your life, in the life of your church, your parish, your community, or the ministry you work on. Just to think about that, to reflect on that. To definitely go read Mark at some point. Think about that tension. And then I'd ask you to think about how specifically would things change if we always operated out of a liturgy of abundance instead of the myth of scarcity. So that's the question I ask myself, and I ask my staff every day. How do we operate out of an abundance, out of liturgy of an abundance, and especially in the age of COVID? How do we operate? How do we organize our advocacy in a way, in an abundant way, in a liturgy of abundance? So I want to just throw two things at you. One that answer that question for me. One is pertains to Bread's vision. Other is a story of work that's being done actually in Indiana as an example of how we operate, how we organize our advocacy from this perspective as opposed to a myth of scarcity. And then I want to just share with you a little bit of a legislative update and some next steps of how you could potentially do that with us in partnership. Let's see here. There we go. So I want to, this is one of the ways that, let me try to get I'm sorry, get the names out of here. All right, there we go. So one of the ways that we approach this in Bread for the World is we try to a liturgy of abundance in our vision and our politics. I would argue broadly, our politics and our political leaders and our laws are created in the context of a myth of scarcity. But that's not what Bread for the World, how Bread for the World tries to operate. I want to pause here because you'll notice I'm not going to spend much time at all talking about the problem. I'm going to assume, I hope correctly, that this is a well-informed crowd who have been paying close attention. Now, the problem of hunger is COVID is a hunger crisis. It's unprecedented, right? We know that last year we had about 37 million hungry people in this country. We expect that to go up by about 18 million due to COVID. Last year we had about 11 million hungry children. We expect that to go up about 18 million. So COVID is a hunger crisis. It is a big problem, right? And I don't want to ignore that or be tone deaf to that. And one other point on that, COVID's also shown just an incredible light on inequality in this country, particularly racial inequality. And each one of those things could be a webinar in and of themselves. But I want to point us to where we go from there instead of dwelling in the problem right now. And if you have questions about that, we can talk about that. But so one of the ways that bread seeks to live into a liturgy of abundance is through our vision. It's in this chart that I'm showing. It's one of my favorite charts because it shows what makes me helpful even in this time. That we know we can end hunger and poverty in this world, and we know because we've shown it here. Because in a sense, there has been an exodus out of hunger over the last couple of decades. The chart on one side worldwide shows the enormous progress that's been made since 1990 in this world. The chart on the orange side is the progress that's been made in the United States. Most of that progress was made in the 1960s and 1970s. Since then, we haven't had an elected leader. We haven't had a government that's made ending hunger or poverty a top 5 priority in this country, and we've held steady and pretty much played defense for the most part. But we know that this can be done. We know that with the appropriate policies, with public and private partnership, organized from the federal, state, local level, that we can end hunger and poverty. And we know because of this, we can see beyond just a crowd of hungry people to a vision of a community, and a community that is one that all are fed.
Okay, Chris, I think we're turning it over to you.
Okay. Well,
Or wait,
yeah, go ahead, Linda.
we have some discussion at this point. Yeah. Wait. Yeah. We've seen the videos, and we've talked a little bit about what advocacy can mean to us. Let's take a few minutes and just to, if you would be willing to share your reactions so far, maybe about what your experience has been with advocacy, what advocacy means to you, and any and what kinds of things the video questions or insights the videos may have provided. Let's see.
I don't mind sharing if you'd like, Linda.
Sure. Yeah.
So my grandfather was a professor of history and political science, and I have always hated politics. Never was interested in it. And I don't know if this is a Southern thing or if this is just a thing, but we didn't talk about politics a lot. It was, meant to be like a private, individual thing, and our family is not my immediate family, but my extended family is divided, and so it was just, don't talk about it. And I've just always hated the contention and unsavory behavior that I have associated with politics. But I think in the last, I don't know, 5 years, I've become more interested in being engaged, just because I have found that advocacy, it's not just going to vote every couple of years. It's there's more that's needed, much more that's needed, and I think since having a kid, I feel even more compelled to try and make long-lasting change for him and for his sake. And that's pretty selfish, actually. I should have felt that before I had a kid, because truly doesn't matter if you have a kid or not. I feel like it's something that you. So I have heard. I've never heard the phrase liturgy of abundance, but I've heard that sentiment that just because someone else is getting something, that they're not taking something away from you. That there's abundance, and that's a good mindset to have. And I also really liked the bishop's message, and how she mentioned Luther was an advocate, and the government is supposed to be outside of church, but the church still can show up in the public square. I feel like that really spoke to me, and yeah, I feel really excited. And just like that, the Bread for the World speaker said that Jesus empowered the disciples. I feel like I'm ready to get empowered and ready to start making change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I must have missed the aphorism he used, that politics shapes policy and policy impacts people. That really resonated with me.
Yeah. Christy, did you have something you wanted to say?
I'm thinking even more than under the government that Martin Luther lived under, we have a responsibility. The government is ours by our choice. Maybe not our individual choice, but certainly our collective choice. The government represents us. And if the government is doing what we cannot approve of, then it is our responsibility to do what we can to change that direction. I've tried to be more active in writing to my representatives and pointing out where I think we need to go as a society. I keep hearing that these letters make a difference. I hope so. It seems to be the easiest thing for me to accomplish.
Yeah, I participate. I'm trying to remember where I heard it. I think it was at a meeting, an online meeting of some members of Voice, which is Virginia. Virginians organized for interfaith community engagement, and they focus a lot on local issues in Northern Virginia as well as at the state level. And oh, I'm sorry.
Happens to all of us.
In saying that long title, I forgot the topic here. Could you summarize again what you said? Then hopefully it will come back.
I was talking about letter writing. Perhaps that was what you were.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes. One of the things that they talked about was they really emphasized the power of relationships among individuals, but also relationships among organizations. And it's like you might be feeling like I'm just one drop of water, but the ocean is made up of millions of drops of water. And in organizing, in getting together in groups around areas of self-interest, like what is going to be the best thing for our kids moving forward in the future, that as a group, people can bring more power to institutional and government power to make a case for that. So that's something that I've learned recently that's really had an impact on my thinking. I think a lot about that. And when I think, oh, what difference is my little letter going to make? It's my letter along with everybody else's letter. And the other thing that they said at the Voice meeting was that the or elected representatives, they do count letters. They do count. They count everyone, every letter, every call that comes in, and log it as and what the position is on a particular issue, and it does have an impact.
I was going to add one other thing, and that's one of the advantages of organizations that have been established. And I'm thinking about the Virginia Interfaith Center, because yes, of course, they encourage you to write letters, but beyond that, they say, this is the piece of legislation, this is what the legislation says, and this is why we're for it or against it. And so when you're doing your letter writing, it's not up to you to do all that background, which I mean, hey, we're working, we have, well, I'm not. Some people are working and so forth. So you have other things to do. And even though you might say, well, this is important, I can't spend full time researching what's going on in the state legislature.
That's very helpful.
Yeah, yeah.
Chris, you're up.
Okay. While both direct service and advocacy are equally important, there are some needs which need a more immediate response. And I'm sure everyone is aware now, well, I should say especially now, of how vital food banks and charities are to feeding those in need. With that in mind, I want to ask you this: of every 10 bags of groceries that feed people who are hungry, how many bags do you think of that 10 do food banks and charities provide? Anybody want to venture a guess?
More than half, I would think.
Nada, you want to post that graphic?
So, and it's, I think, the 1 in 20, yes?
Well, well, we were going to post them 1 in 10, but there's either one, but 1 in 20 would, it's actually 1 in 20 for worldwide, we believe, and 1 in 10 in this country. And that is that 1 in 10 bags of groceries feed people who are hungry that come from church food pantries and other private charities. It's federal nutrition programs, from school meals to SNAP benefits, that provide the rest.
Oh.
Kind of a surprise for all of us, I think.
Yeah.
I want to skip on to give an example of, because we're kind of short on time here, but to give you one example of how direct service and can impact government. Many of you know that I've been involved with the ACA Pantry, of course, but I've also been able to have the opportunity to sit on a couple Fairfax County committees that were formed in response to the pandemic. And this has kind of allowed me to see how intertwined direct service organization and government services are, but also how government policies have a direct impact on those who receive services from charitable organizations. To illustrate this, one of the chief concerns of our team was that undocumented workers were afraid to ask the county for assistance because they would be, deported, or the information used against them later on when applying for residency. I, among others, repeatedly brought this up at county meetings, even contacting Chairman McKay's office about it. But we're constantly reminded that the county didn't request documentation for assistance, though that information was never included on emails or flyers being distributed. But in the last month or so, a work group was actually formed by the county to look into any obstacles that prevented those needing help from seeking it. And where the undocumented immigrants' fear was brought up by many of those involved with direct service, I also noticed that Chairman McKay had 2 members of his staff on that committee, so on the work group. And And right about that same time, the committee was beginning to meet. McKay released a statement that for the first time publicly stated that legal documentation would not be requested. And then shortly thereafter, the same wording went into a new flyer that was being distributed by the county. It remains to be seen what effect that's going to have, but it just goes to illustrate how a simple change in policy, the wording of a document, can potentially have a significant impact. Now, I'll go into more details about different organizations and how direct service and advocacy are interrelated at our next meeting and give some more examples. But I just wanted to stress that link now and stress how, we need to keep feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, treating the addicted, but we must also get to the root of the problems that cause these problems if we really want real change. That's pretty much wraps up our presentation. So if anybody has any questions, I believe we've got a full minute until 2 o'clock, until the midnight hour. So if anybody wants to ask something, please feel free.
So we're going to use this group to pass on information among each other about
Which group?
This group here assembled.
Come to session 2 and find out.
I like it. I like it.
Oh,
I mean, if we have 30 seconds, I'd like to know if we were doing this again, is this helpful or it was too simple? Just a brief comment. What do you think?
I think it felt to me like a good intro. And I admit, I feel a little bit like what Chris was talking about being a hobbyist.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of need somebody to sit me down and say, do this, this, and this, and it will be useful.
Okay.
Yes.
I think that's what we have planned more of that kind of thing for the second.
And congratulations on finishing a meeting on time.
And with that, I'm going to stop the recording so there's no contrary proof.
You are sneaky.
If I can figure